worked as an industrial electrician at a paper mill for almost 6 years. If you've never worked around industrial equipment, it's hard to explain how dangerous a paper mill can be. People picture conveyor belts and giant rolls of paper. They don't picture thousands of volts running through aging electrical systems, motors the size of pickup trucks, steam lines hot enough to melt skin, and machinery powerful enough to pull a person inside before anyone has time to react. Because of that, our company had one rule they never compromised on. Nobody entered a high-voltage area alone. Every electrician worked with a safety partner. For almost 2 years, mine was a guy named Daniel. Daniel had already been at the mill for nearly a decade before I was hired. Everybody respected him. He wasn't loud. He wasn't the kind of guy who tried to impress people. He just knew everything. Every electrical room, every breaker panel, every emergency shutdown. If a machine started acting strangely, Daniel usually knew what the problem was before maintenance even called us. People joked that he could hear equipment failing from the other side of the building. I laughed along with everyone else. After all, he seemed to prove it over and over again. Whenever something serious happened, Daniel was already there. At the time, I thought that was experience. Looking back, that's the first thing I should have questioned. The first major incident happened during our annual winter shutdown. Parts of the mill were still operating while other departments were being serviced. Daniel and I were replacing wiring inside one of the older conveyor systems when the maintenance radio suddenly crackled. Electrical emergency. Conveyor 7. We sprinted across the building. Smoke was pouring from the motor housing. The maintenance crew was backing away because nobody knew if the cabinet was still energized. Before anyone else reacted, Daniel shoved past everyone. He reached the disconnect panel and killed the power. Seconds later, flames shot from inside the cabinet. If he'd waited even a few more moments, someone probably would have been electrocuted trying to fight the fire. The plant manager shook his hand afterward. "So glad you were close." Daniel only smiled. Good timing. Everyone called him a hero, including me. About a month later, we were servicing a hydraulic press used to compress recycled pulp. I had just removed the access panel when Daniel suddenly grabbed my shoulder. "Back up." His voice wasn't loud, but something about it made me move immediately. The hydraulic line burst less than 2 seconds later. Steel fragments blasted across the maintenance platform. One piece punched through the metal cabinet where I'd been standing. Again, Daniel had somehow reacted before anyone else. When I thanked him later, he shrugged. "You learn to notice the little signs." I believed him. A few weeks after that, we were inspecting an electrical cabinet feeding power to one of the drying machines. Everything looked normal. I opened the door. Daniel suddenly yanked me backward by my jacket. An explosion erupted inside the cabinet. A bright blue arc flashed across the room. The blast knocked both of us onto the concrete floor. My face shield was scorched. The front of my gloves had melted. If I'd still been standing there, I probably wouldn't be telling this story. For the third time, Daniel had saved my life. Word spread quickly. People started requesting him whenever difficult repairs came up. Even supervisors relaxed when they heard Daniel was assigned to a problem. If he was there, everyone assumed things would be handled safely. I felt the same way. He became more than a coworker. He became someone I trusted completely. That's why what happened next never made sense. One Monday morning, I walked into the maintenance shop and noticed Daniel's locker was open. Empty. I figured he'd taken vacation. Then our supervisor gathered everyone together. Daniel resigned over the weekend. No notice. No retirement. No goodbye. Just a short resignation email sent late Saturday night. His company phone had been left on his toolbox. His uniforms were folded inside a cardboard box. That was it. Nobody knew where he'd gone. The following week, I was assigned a new safety partner, a younger electrician named Chris. I expected the usual chaos. Paper mills break down constantly. Except, nothing happened. 1 week passed. Then another. No emergency shutdowns. No electrical fires. No cabinet failures. No hydraulic explosions. It wasn't just quiet. It was unusually quiet. During our monthly safety meeting, management actually congratulated everyone. They said the mill had gone nearly a month without a serious equipment failure. People applauded. Then the plant engineer slowly lowered his paperwork. He frowned. Finally, he said something that made the room completely silent. That shouldn't be possible. At first, everyone thought he meant we'd simply gotten lucky. But after the meeting, he disappeared into his office. Over the next several days, engineering pulled maintenance records going back years. Eventually, corporate investigators arrived. Nobody told us why. Rumors spread across the plant. Equipment defects, insurance issues, government inspections. Nobody actually knew. About a week later, Chris quietly told me investigators wanted to interview both of us. The first question surprised me. How often did Daniel arrive before emergency calls were dispatched? I laughed. What do you mean? The investigator slid several printed timelines across the table. According to radio logs, Daniel had reached multiple equipment failures before dispatch officially notified electricians. I stared at the timestamps. That couldn't be right. Then he asked another question. Did you ever notice Daniel insisting on certain job assignments? Actually, yes. Whenever schedules changed, Daniel always volunteered to cover specific areas, usually the same equipment. The investigator made another note. Then he thanked me and ended the interview. Over the following month, entire machines were dismantled. Electrical panels were shipped to independent laboratories. Every major failure Daniel had responded to was re-examined. The results shocked everyone. Inside one disconnect switch, investigators found a tiny copper shaving, hidden behind a breaker, small enough to escape visual inspection, large enough to create an intermittent short circuit after weeks of vibration. Inside another cabinet, someone had loosened a terminal screw less than half a turn, barely noticeable. Eventually, heat and vibration caused the connection to fail catastrophically. Another motor contained contaminated lubricant. A pressure sensor had been adjusted by fractions of a millimeter. Every failure looked accidental, until investigators viewed them together. Each one required less than a minute to create. Each one guaranteed a dangerous failure eventually, and every single machine had been serviced by Daniel shortly beforehand. The investigators reached a conclusion none of us wanted to believe. The accidents weren't accidents. Someone had been creating emergencies, not large enough to destroy the plant, not deadly enough to attract immediate suspicion, just dangerous enough that an experienced electrician could step in, solve the problem, and look like a hero. Police searched Daniel's locker. There wasn't much left, just an old notebook tucked beneath the bottom shelf. Every page listed equipment numbers, inspection dates, maintenance schedules, nothing unusual, until detectives reached the back of the notebook. Beside dozens of machine numbers was my employee ID. Again, and again, and again. One detective asked me something I'll never forget. How many times did Daniel tell you to move before something failed? At first I couldn't answer. Then memories started flooding back. The conveyor fire, the hydraulic press, the electrical cabinet, the steam valve, the transformer room, the cooling pumps. Every single time, Daniel had positioned me exactly where he wanted me, seconds before becoming the one who rescued me. I stopped counting after 12. I transferred to another mill 6 weeks later. Almost a year passed before one of the investigators called me. He apologized for contacting me out of the blue. Then he said they wanted me to know the case was officially suspended. They had never located Daniel. The identification he'd used to get hired turned out to be fraudulent. The address on his employment paperwork belonged to a vacant farmhouse scheduled for demolition. The social security number had been stolen from someone who died years earlier. No previous employer could verify he'd ever worked there. No tax history, no medical records, nothing. Officially, it was as if he'd appeared out of nowhere, worked beside me for 2 years, and then disappeared again. People usually assume the thing that still haunts me is learning those emergencies had been staged. It isn't. The part that still keeps me awake, is remembering how relieved I felt every single time I saw Daniel running toward me, because I thought help had arrived, when the truth was, the only reason I ever needed saving was because he had planned it that way all along. I worked the night shift at a regional warehouse that supplied grocery stores across 3 states. The building never really slept. Even at 3 in the morning, there were forklifts moving through the aisles, trailers backing into loading docks, and pallet wrappers humming somewhere in the distance. It wasn't exciting work, but it paid well. Most of us had been there for years. Night shift was a small crew. Everybody knew everybody. If someone new was hired, word spread before they even showed up. About 2 years ago, one of our forklift operators quit without notice. Management filled the position almost immediately. The new guy introduced himself as Eric. He looked to be in his early 30s, average height. Brown hair, clean cut, the kind of face you'd forget 5 minutes after meeting him. Since I'd been there the longest, the supervisor asked me to train him. For the first few nights, everything seemed normal. Eric barely talked. He listened carefully, never complained. By the end of his first week, he could operate every piece of equipment in the warehouse. That alone impressed everyone. Most new hires took months to learn the layout. Eric memorized it in days. He knew every aisle number, every emergency exit, every alarm code, every supervisor's name. He even remembered which vending machine ate your money and which dock door always jammed during rainstorms. People started joking that he'd secretly worked there before. He'd just smile. "I pay attention." It seemed like a reasonable answer, until the questions started. One night we were eating in the break room around 2 in the morning. There were 6 of us sitting around the table. Out of nowhere, Eric looked at me and said, "So, does your daughter still have piano lessons on Thursdays?" For a second I honestly thought I'd misheard him. "What?" He repeated it. "Your daughter, Thursday lessons, still going?" The room went quiet. I had never mentioned my daughter at work. Not once. Most of my coworkers didn't even know I had children. I laughed because I didn't know what else to do. "You've got me confused with somebody else." Eric frowned. "Oh, maybe." Then he went back to eating like nothing had happened. I convinced myself another employee must have mentioned my family. People talk. It wasn't impossible. A few days later we were unloading a trailer together. Eric asked whether my wife's Subaru had finally stopped making that clicking noise. I nearly dropped the pallet jack. My wife did drive a Subaru. It had developed a clicking sound near the front wheel a month earlier. We hadn't told anyone. When I asked how he knew that, he simply shrugged. "I thought you mentioned it." I hadn't. The conversations kept happening. Always casual. Always brief. He asked whether I still hiked the Pine Hollow Trail on Sunday mornings. He asked if I'd ever found another dog after Murphy died. Murphy had been my childhood Labrador. He died when I was 16. There wasn't a single photograph of him online. One night he even asked whether my mother had recovered after her knee replacement. She lived 4 hours away. Nobody at work even knew she'd had surgery. I stopped sleeping well. I began wondering if someone was playing a joke, so I quietly asked a few coworkers whether they'd been talking about my family. Every one of them looked confused. Most of them knew almost nothing about my personal life. One of them laughed. "I don't even know your wife's name." That was true. I intentionally kept work and home separate. The more I thought about it, the less sense it made. I finally went to human resources. I felt ridiculous sitting there. How do you explain that a coworker knows things he shouldn't? The HR manager agreed to pull Eric's hiring paperwork. Everything looked perfect. Application complete. Background check passed. Drug screening clear. Employment history verified. References checked. There was nothing suspicious. Then she paused. She leaned closer to the employee file. Something about the photo bothered her. She called another HR employee over. The two of them stared at it for nearly a minute. Finally, she looked at me. "That's strange." The photograph attached to Eric's employment application wasn't Eric. Same height, similar build, different face. She assumed someone had uploaded the wrong image. To verify it, security pulled the orientation footage recorded on Eric's first day. The room became silent. The man attending orientation was the same person shown in the employee file, but he wasn't the man who had been working beside me every night for the past 3 weeks. Security rewound the footage twice. There was no mistake. Someone else had attended orientation. Someone else had completed the paperwork. Somehow, the man working in our warehouse wasn't the person the company believed they'd hired. Management immediately planned to confront him the following night. They asked me not to say anything. I agreed, but something about the situation kept bothering me. For the first time in years, I called in sick, Around midnight, I was sitting in my living room when my phone buzzed. It was a motion alert from my front door camera. I opened the live feed. A man wearing our warehouse uniform was slowly walking up my driveway. He stopped beneath the porch light. Even through the grainy night vision, I recognized him. Eric. He wasn't looking toward the house. He was looking directly into the camera. He stood there perfectly still. 1 minute passed, then another. He never knocked, never reached for the doorbell. He simply stared at the front of my house. Finally, he turned around, walked back down the driveway, and disappeared into the darkness. I called the police. By the time officers arrived, he was gone. The next morning I drove straight to work. His locker had already been cleaned out. Human Resources told everyone he'd resigned overnight. No email, no explanation. His employee badge had been left on the supervisor's desk. His uniform had been folded neatly inside a cardboard box. As the supervisor picked it up, something caught his attention. Stitched inside the collar was a different employee's name. Not Eric, someone none of us had ever heard of. Police became involved almost immediately. They reviewed security footage from the previous month. The strangest part wasn't watching Eric arrive every night. It was watching him leave. Several times, he remained in the employee parking lot long after everyone else had gone home, sometimes for over an hour. He never used his phone, never smoked, never spoke to anyone. He simply sat inside his car, watching employees drive away one by one. The investigation lasted months. Detectives eventually determined that every document used to hire Eric belonged to a real person, a man who had moved overseas almost 5 years earlier. His identity had been stolen. No one ever identified the man who actually worked beside me. His fingerprints matched nobody in the criminal database. His vehicle had been registered using another false identity. He seemed to appear from nowhere, just long enough to work beside me. People usually ask whether I ever saw him again. I didn't, at least not in person. About 6 months after he disappeared, I was replacing the batteries in one of my home security cameras. While scrolling through older recordings, I noticed something I'd somehow missed. The video from that night didn't begin when he walked up my driveway. It began 12 minutes earlier. He had already been standing across the street, just outside the camera's view, watching my house, waiting, as if he already knew I would be home. I worked as a production supervisor at a manufacturing plant for almost 9 years. The factory ran 24 hours a day, 3 shifts, hundreds of employees, dozens of production lines. If one department fell behind, the entire building felt it. Every Friday afternoon, the following week's schedule was posted on a large bulletin board outside the break room. Departments, machines, lunch rotations, break times, overtime assignments. Everything was planned days in advance. Most people barely glanced at it. You looked for your name, complained if you got stuck with Saturday overtime, and went home. Nobody ever questioned how those schedules were made. Until our senior scheduler retired. His name was Harold. He'd worked there for over 30 years. Quiet guy. Never caused problems. He rarely left his office except to pin the new schedule to the board every Friday. When he retired, management gave him a cake, a plaque, and a standing ovation. The following Monday, a younger supervisor took over scheduling. About a week later, he stopped by my office holding a stack of paperwork. He looked confused. "Have you always requested machine 12? I laughed. "I've never requested any machine." He frowned. "That's strange." He handed me several request forms. Everyone listed my employee number. Everyone requested machine 12 on nearly every Tuesday for the previous 18 months. At the bottom was my signature. At least, it looked like my signature. The handwriting was nearly identical. The only thing that stood out was the letter T in my last name. Whoever signed these crossed it with one long straight line. I'd always used a short cross. It was such a tiny difference. I almost missed it. The new scheduler assumed someone had forged the paperwork as a prank. Human Resources wasn't concerned. They'd dealt with practical jokes before. Still, they decided to check a few more files. By lunchtime, they stopped laughing. Nearly 40 employees had submitted similar request forms. Different workstations, different departments, different lunch periods, different parking areas. different overtime shifts. Every request carried a nearly perfect copy of the employee's signature. Nobody remembered filling out any of them. Every single request had been approved by Harold. Management reviewed security footage from the scheduling office. Unfortunately, the cameras only stored recordings for 90 days. Harold had retired before that. There was nothing left to review. At first it looked like an elaborate forgery. Then engineering noticed something no one else had. They compared old schedules with workplace incident reports. A strange pattern appeared. Every time someone had quietly been reassigned to another machine, their original workstation experienced an accident. Sometimes it was a forklift clipping a rack. Sometimes a hydraulic hose burst. Sometimes a conveyor motor caught fire. A chemical spill. A collapsed pallet. A machine failure. None of the accidents killed anyone. Most caused only minor injuries. But every single incident happened where another employee had originally been scheduled to stand. The room became very quiet. Someone finally asked the question everyone was thinking. What if Harold wasn't moving people for no reason? Investigators spent weeks reconstructing old schedules. One by one, they matched forged requests with accident reports. Again, and again, and again, someone had been quietly moved away from danger only hours before an incident occurred. Corporate investigators were called in. At first they suspected Harold had somehow known equipment was about to fail. Engineers disagreed. Many of the failures couldn't have been predicted. A forklift driver suffered a medical emergency. A contractor accidentally struck a gas line. A supplier delivered defective chemicals. None of those events appeared in maintenance records. Yet, somehow, the right employees had already been reassigned elsewhere. Police became involved. They searched Harold's office before it was remodeled. Most of the cabinets had already been emptied. Inside the bottom drawer of his old desk, they found a locked metal box. The company had never been given a key. A locksmith opened it. Inside were hundreds of schedule request forms. Not from the past, from the future. 6 months worth. Already completed. Already signed. Employees who had since transferred were still listed. Workers who had resigned months earlier still appeared on future schedules. Even 2 employees who had already died in unrelated accidents had assigned shifts. The investigators assumed the paperwork had simply never been updated. Then they reached the final section. Every page contained my name, different departments, different machines, different lunch breaks, different parking spaces, dozens of schedule changes stretching nearly half a year into the future. Someone asked why. Nobody had an answer. Management immediately destroyed every unsigned schedule. The company never contacted Harold. By then he had already sold his house. His pension payments were being deposited into an account that had been closed. His listed forwarding address belonged to an empty storage unit. No one could locate him. I transferred to another facility less than a month later. I wanted nothing to do with that building anymore. Life eventually returned to normal. At least, that's what I told myself. About 6 months later, I was cleaning out an old filing cabinet in my garage. Most of the boxes held tax paperwork and instruction manuals. At the very bottom, I found a folded production schedule I'd accidentally taken home after one of our Friday meetings. I almost threw it away. Then I noticed something written in pencil beneath my forged signature. It wasn't there when I'd first received the schedule. Someone had written it afterward. The handwriting matched Harold's notes I'd seen for years. It said only one sentence. You never noticed how many times I kept you away from him. There was no name, no explanation, just that one line. For weeks I convinced myself it was some kind of joke. Then I started thinking about everyone I'd worked with over the years. The contractors, the delivery drivers, the temporary employees, the people who came and went so often that nobody remembered their names. I still don't know who Harold believed he was protecting me from. Maybe he was losing his mind. Maybe he'd become obsessed with patterns that didn't exist. Or maybe every forged schedule, every fake request, every unexplained reassignment had prevented me from crossing paths with someone I was never supposed to meet. The factory still operates today. Sometimes former coworkers tell me nothing unusual has happened there since Harold retired. No impossible schedule changes. No mysterious reassigned shifts. No strange requests appearing in employee files. They always say it like it's a good thing. I usually just nod. Because every Friday, when I write my own work schedule, I still catch myself wondering whether the place I'm supposed to be is really the safest place to stand.